Baton Rouge, Louisiana, September 15th, 1847. Picture a moonless night when 8 pairs of calloused hands dragged their screaming master toward the very wash basin where he had murdered their brothers. The water that had once run red with innocent blood would finally claim the monster who had spilled it. Tonight, justice would not come from a courthouse or a preacher's sermon. It would rise from the depths of human desperation, delivered by souls who had nothing left to lose. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of plantation brutality. It's the story of how evil can be so absolute that even the most God-fearing people choose damnation over submission. These weren't criminals or revolutionaries. They were fathers, sons, and brothers who watched their master transform a simple wash basin into an instrument of torture so horrific that death became their only salvation. The official records call it a tragic accident, but the truth is far more terrifying and infinitely more justified. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we gather the bravest souls who dare to uncover history's most deliberately buried secrets. I'm about to share a story that powerful families spent generations trying to erase, a story so disturbing that it challenges everything you thought you knew about resistance, justice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. Do you have the strength to hear what really happened in the shadows of Whitmore Plantation? If you're ready to join this investigation, subscribe now and comment your location below, because the truth needs witnesses, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. Meet Cornelius Whitmore, a name that should make your blood run cold, though you've probably never heard it before. To the genteel society of New Orleans, he was a pillar of the community, a successful plantation owner, a generous church donor, and a charming dinner party host who could quote scripture with the passion of a preacher. His neighbors saw a man who always dressed impeccably, spoke eloquently about the burden of civilizing his African charges, and maintained one of the most profitable sugar operations in the state. But here's what they didn't see, or chose not to see. Cornelius Whitmore was a sadist whose appetite for human suffering knew no bounds. Behind his kind eyes and gentle smile lurked something fundamentally broken, something that found genuine pleasure in the systematic torture of human beings. He didn't just see his enslaved people as property. He saw them as toys to be played with until they broke. And when they broke, he found creative ways to dispose of them. The wash basin in his courtyard wasn't just for cleaning, it was his personal torture chamber, where he had perfected the art of slow drowning, bringing victims to the brink of death before reviving them, only to begin the process again. The official story, the one carefully crafted and spread throughout Louisiana high society, painted Cornelius as a progressive master who was reforming his difficult slaves through innovative discipline techniques. He claimed his methods were based on the latest scientific understanding of African psychology, developed in consultation with prominent physicians and behavioral experts from Europe. To visiting plantation owners and curious neighbors, he would demonstrate his humane correction system, explaining how strategic water immersion could break stubborn behaviors without permanently damaging valuable property. He spoke eloquently about how this technique was far more effective than traditional whipping, which often rendered slaves unable to work for weeks. Visitors marveled at how docile and obedient his enslaved workforce appeared, never questioning why their eyes held no spark of life, or why they moved like ghosts through their daily tasks. The local community praised his innovation and efficiency, with several neighboring plantations requesting detailed instructions on implementing similar reform programs. Even the regional Methodist minister held up Whitmore as an example of Christian stewardship, praising his efforts to civilize and educate his charges through firm but merciful discipline. This carefully constructed narrative provided perfect cover for what was actually happening behind the mansion's walls. Systematic torture disguised as enlightened slave management. Let's be real. What Cornelius built at Whitmore Plantation was nothing short of a torture complex designed with the precision of an engineer and the cruelty of a demon. The wash basin itself was no ordinary washing facility. It was a custom-built stone construction, deeper and wider than necessary, with iron rings embedded in its sides for securing chains and restraints. Adjacent to the basin stood a series of wooden contraptions that appeared to be drying racks for laundry, but were actually designed to hold victims at precise angles for optimal suffering. The plantation's layout had been deliberately modified to create perfect acoustic isolation. The slave quarters were positioned just far enough from the main house that screams would be muffled, while strategic landscaping of thick magnolia trees and Spanish moss created a natural sound barrier. Whitmore had even installed a sophisticated drainage system that allowed him to quickly dispose of evidence, with underground channels that carried bloodied water directly to the swamplands where alligators would consume any remaining traces. The plantation's medical facilities, supposedly for treating sick slaves, were actually equipped with instruments for reviving nearly drowned victims and treating injuries just enough to keep them alive for further torture. Most disturbing of all was his record-keeping system, detailed journals hidden in a secret compartment of his study, where he documented his experiments with the methodical precision of a scientist studying laboratory rats. When neighboring plantation owners occasionally noticed irregularities, unusually high mortality rates, the strange docility of Whitmore's workforce, or the odd sounds that sometimes drifted from the plantation at night, Cornelius had perfectly reasonable explanations ready. The high death rate? An unfortunate consequence of recent African imports who hadn't yet adapted to Louisiana's climate and diseases. The unusual behavior of his slaves. The remarkable success of his revolutionary training methods, which he was still refining and couldn't yet share publicly. The night sounds. Wild animals from the nearby swamps, drawn by the plantation's proximity to the wetlands. He would invite skeptical neighbors for carefully orchestrated tours, showing them only what he wanted them to see, while explaining away any concerning evidence with the authority of a man whose success spoke for itself. Local physicians who examined his slaves were told they were suffering from a new form of tropical melancholy that affected recently imported Africans, causing them to become withdrawn and lethargic, a condition that Whitmore claimed to be treating with innovative therapeutic techniques. Even the parish coroner, when presented with bodies that showed signs of drowning, accepted Whitmore's explanations about accidents involving careless slaves who had fallen into water cisterns or irrigation channels while working at night. The local constabulary was so thoroughly convinced of Whitmore's respectability that they rarely bothered to investigate complaints from the slave quarters, dismissing such reports as typical exaggerations from discontented property. Now you have to understand, monsters like Cornelius Whitmore don't operate in complete isolation. They need enablers, and Cornelius found his in Marcus Beauregard, his plantation overseer, and the only white man who knew the full extent of the horrors occurring at Whitmore Plantation. Beauregard wasn't just an employee, he was a willing participant who had been corrupted by years of witnessing and eventually participating in Cornelius's sadistic games. Originally hired as a traditional overseer, Beauregard had gradually been drawn deeper into Whitmore's world through a combination of generous financial incentives, blackmail involving his own dark secrets, and the slow erosion of his moral boundaries. He became the perfect accomplice, intelligent enough to help refine the torture methods, ruthless enough to help select victims, and connected enough to local law enforcement to ensure that any investigations would be quickly stifled. Beauregard managed the plantation's public face while Cornelius indulged his private demons, creating a two-man conspiracy that functioned with terrifying efficiency. He recruited other plantation workers who could be trusted to keep secrets, building a network of complicit individuals who were either too terrified, too corrupted, or too well compensated to speak out. Most chillingly, Beauregard kept detailed records of his own, documenting not just the crimes, but the psychological profiles of potential victims, identifying which enslaved people were most likely to be missed and which had family members who might cause trouble if they disappeared. I want you to picture the faces of the men, women, and children who suffered under Cornelius Whitmore's reign of terror, because their names and stories were systematically erased from official records, but they deserve to be remembered. These weren't faceless property. They were human beings with hopes, dreams, families, and an unbreakable spirit that even torture couldn't fully crush. There was Samuel, a skilled blacksmith who had tried to protect younger slaves from Whitmore's attention and paid for his courage with months of systematic torture. There was Grace, a young mother who had begged Whitmore to spare her infant son and was drowned in the wash basin while her baby was forced to watch. There was old Moses, a grandfather figure who had tried to lead secret prayer meetings and was subjected to mock baptisms that nearly killed him every Sunday for 6 months. These victims shared common characteristics that made them targets. They were natural leaders. They showed defiance or tried to protect others, or they simply caught Whitmore's attention at the wrong moment with the wrong expression on their faces. Many were skilled craftsmen whose deaths represented not just human tragedy, but significant economic loss, a fact that made Whitmore's willingness to kill them even more disturbing. They came from different African tribes, spoke different languages, and had different cultural traditions, but they were united in their suffering and their desperate hope for deliverance from a hell that seemed to have no end. Enter Thomas Caldwell, a traveling Methodist circuit preacher whose unexpected arrival at Whitmore Plantation on a foggy October evening would change everything. Caldwell wasn't supposed to be there. His planned route had been disrupted by a broken wagon wheel, forcing him to seek shelter at the nearest plantation, which happened to be Whitmore's. As a respected minister with connections throughout the region, Caldwell couldn't simply be turned away without arousing suspicion, so Cornelius was forced to offer him hospitality while frantically trying to conceal his ongoing activities. But late that night, drawn by sounds he initially mistook for someone in distress calling for help, Caldwell witnessed something that shattered his faith in humanity and haunted him for the rest of his life. Through the window of his guest room, he saw Cornelius and Beauregard holding down a young enslaved woman in the wash basin, taking turns pushing her under the water and bringing her to the edge of consciousness before reviving her. The scene was made even more horrific by Cornelius's obvious sexual arousal and the systematic, almost clinical way they conducted the torture. Caldwell watched in frozen horror as they repeated the process for what felt like hours, documenting each stage in their journals like scientists conducting an experiment. When the woman finally stopped fighting and her body went limp, he saw them calmly dispose of her remains in the drainage system they had perfected. The preacher spent the rest of the night in his room, paralyzed by terror and moral anguish, knowing that he had witnessed pure evil but unsure how to respond without becoming the next victim. Thomas Caldwell left Whitmore Plantation the next morning, a broken man, carrying with him the terrible knowledge of what he had witnessed, but knowing that speaking out could mean his death. His first attempts to report the crime to local authorities met with polite disbelief and subtle threats. After all, who would believe such outrageous accusations against one of the region's most respected plantation owners? The sheriff, who had been hunting and drinking with Cornelius for years, suggested that the preacher had perhaps suffered a nightmare brought on by the stress of his broken wagon and the unfamiliar surroundings. Other officials implied that making such inflammatory claims against a pillar of the community could be seen as defamatory, potentially resulting in serious legal consequences for the accuser. Caldwell's own Methodist superiors were equally unsympathetic, warning him that spreading such fantasies could damage the church's reputation and relationships with prominent parishioners who donated generously to religious causes. The trauma of what he had witnessed, combined with his inability to find anyone willing to listen, began to consume him from within. He developed severe insomnia, lost significant weight, and began drinking heavily in an attempt to forget the images that played endlessly in his mind. His sermons became increasingly erratic, filled with references to biblical justice and divine retribution that made his congregations uncomfortable. Within months, church officials had quietly transferred him to a remote parish in Arkansas, effectively silencing him while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives for the reassignment. When persistent rumors about missing slaves finally forced local authorities to conduct a perfunctory investigation of Whitmore Plantation, the entire process was designed from the beginning to find nothing incriminating. The parish sheriff, who had been receiving generous donations from Cornelius for years, announced the investigation publicly but privately warned Whitmore well in advance, giving him ample time to prepare. The official inspection was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, complete with a formal dinner invitation that transformed the investigation into a social event attended by local dignitaries. Investigators were shown only the most benign areas of the plantation, while the wash basin was temporarily covered and disguised as a construction project for improved slave sanitation facilities. Any enslaved people who might have served as witnesses had been temporarily relocated to remote work sites or locked away in punishment cells where investigators couldn't access them. The slaves who were interviewed had been carefully coached on what to say, with threats against their families ensuring their compliance. Beauregard presented forged documentation showing that all reported missing individuals had either been sold to plantations in distant states, died of natural causes, or successfully escaped, all completely normal occurrences that required no further investigation. The investigators, who had no desire to uncover evidence that would force them to take action against a powerful community member, accepted these explanations with obvious relief. Their final report concluded that while Whitmore's discipline methods might be unusually strict, they found no evidence of any criminal activity and praised his efforts to maintain order among a challenging population. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because the most damning evidence of Cornelius Whitmore's crimes wasn't hidden in secret chambers or buried in swamplands, but walking around in plain sight, forever marked by trauma that had fundamentally altered their humanity. The enslaved people who had survived Whitmore's torture bore invisible scars that manifested in ways that anyone with eyes could see if they had cared to look. Survivors of the wash basin displayed a distinctive form of psychological damage. They would freeze in terror at the sight of standing water, break into violent trembling when it rained, and wake screaming from nightmares about drowning. Many had developed chronic respiratory problems from near-drowning experiences, while others showed signs of neurological damage from oxygen deprivation during torture sessions. But perhaps most disturbing was the way survivors moved through the world, like living ghosts, their spirits so thoroughly broken that they seemed to exist in a perpetual state of dissociation from their own bodies. They would respond to commands with mechanical precision, but showed no emotional reactions to praise, punishment, or even physical pain. Their eyes held a peculiar emptiness that unnerved even hardened slave traders, who found that Whitmore's disciplined slaves were difficult to resell because they unsettled potential buyers. Local physicians who examined these individuals noted their unusual symptoms, but attributed them to inherent racial characteristics rather than recognizing them as evidence of systematic torture. The medical establishment of the time was so deeply invested in theories about African inferiority that they interpreted trauma responses as proof of racial difference rather than evidence of criminal abuse. What you're about to hear will make you understand why 8 desperate men decided that death was preferable to allowing this monster to continue his work. Cornelius Whitmore had developed what he considered a scientific approach to human torture, complete with detailed methodologies and careful documentation of results. His journals, discovered years later, revealed the mind of a man who had turned sadism into a systematic study, treating human suffering as a research subject to be explored with academic rigor. He had identified what he called optimal drowning protocols, precise timing for submersion and revival that would maximize psychological trauma while minimizing the risk of accidental death before he was finished with his victims. His methods included graduated exposure to water torture, starting with brief immersions and building up to extended sessions that could last hours. He documented heart rates, breathing patterns, and psychological responses with the detachment of a scientist studying laboratory animals. Whitmore had even developed specialized restraining devices that allowed him to control victims' positions during torture, ensuring they experienced maximum helplessness and terror. His records showed that he had identified certain ethnic groups and personality types that responded differently to various torture techniques, leading him to develop customized approaches for different individuals. Most disturbingly, his journals revealed that he viewed his work as contributing to broader scientific understanding of human psychology and racial characteristics, believing that his torture sessions were generating valuable data about the African mind and its capacity for suffering. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic evil disguised as research, conducted by a man who had convinced himself that he was advancing human knowledge through the infliction of unimaginable suffering. Now, let me tell you about Benjamin Carter, a man whose name should be remembered alongside other heroes of resistance, though history has tried its best to bury his story. Benjamin wasn't born into slavery. He had been a free man in Virginia, working as a skilled carpenter and saving money to purchase his wife and children from a neighboring plantation. But one wrong turn on a dark road had changed everything. He was kidnapped by slave catchers, his free papers destroyed, and sold to Cornelius Whitmore, despite his desperate protests about his legal status. Benjamin brought something to Whitmore Plantation that the other enslaved people hadn't possessed: the memory of freedom and the unshakable belief that he had the right to fight for his dignity. Unlike those who had been born into bondage, Benjamin knew what life could be like without chains, and that knowledge burned inside him like a flame that no amount of torture could extinguish. He was intelligent, literate, though he carefully hid this fact, and possessed natural leadership qualities that made other enslaved people instinctively look to him for guidance. But Benjamin also carried the weight of profound loss. He had been forced to leave behind his pregnant wife and 2 young children, not knowing if they were alive or dead, not knowing if he would ever see them again. This combination of hope, rage, and desperate love made him uniquely dangerous to the existing order at Whitmore Plantation. He began quietly organizing resistance efforts, creating networks of communication between enslaved workers, and carefully documenting the crimes he witnessed with plans to someday bear witness before authorities who might actually listen. Benjamin Carter understood that defeating a monster like Cornelius Whitmore would require more than righteous anger. It would require intelligence, patience, and careful planning. Using his carpentry skills as cover, Benjamin gained access to areas of the plantation that were normally off-limits to enslaved workers, allowing him to observe and document Whitmore's activities with unprecedented detail. He repaired windows near the wash basin, built shelving in storage areas where torture implements were kept, and conducted maintenance work in the mansion itself, where he could access Whitmore's private papers. Benjamin discovered the hidden journals and carefully memorized their contents, understanding that these records could serve as evidence if he ever found authorities willing to listen. He also began mapping the plantation's layout, identifying escape routes, and documenting the drainage system that Whitmore used to dispose of evidence. Most importantly, Benjamin started building a network of allies among the enslaved population, identifying individuals who had both the courage and the capability to take action when the time came. He shared information carefully, using coded conversations and subtle signals to coordinate resistance activities without arousing suspicion from Beauregard or the other overseers. Benjamin also began stockpiling supplies and weapons, hiding tools and materials that could be used in an eventual escape attempt or, if escape proved impossible, in a final confrontation with their tormentors. His investigation revealed that Whitmore's crimes extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, involving not just individual torture, but a systematic program of experimentation that had already claimed dozens of lives and would continue claiming more until someone found a way to stop it. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where desperate men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance make a choice that will haunt your dreams and challenge everything you believe about justice, morality, and the price of freedom. What Benjamin Carter and his allies discovered about Cornelius Whitmore's plans was so horrific that it left them with no choice but to take actions that would damn their souls in the eyes of the law, but save their humanity in the eyes of God. I need you to understand that what you're about to hear isn't just a story from the past. It's a window into the darkest corners of human nature, where evil and desperation collide in ways that reveal both the worst and the best of what people are capable of. If you're still with me, if you have the strength to face the truth that powerful people have spent generations trying to bury, then stay subscribed, because the next part of this investigation will show you exactly what happens when good men are forced to become monsters in order to stop a greater evil. Comment below if you think you know how this story ends, because I guarantee you don't. The moment everything changed came on a suffocating July evening in 1847, when Benjamin Carter made a discovery that transformed him from a man seeking justice into a man preparing for war. While repairing floorboards in Whitmore's study, Benjamin discovered a hidden compartment containing not just the torture journals he already knew about, but something far more sinister: detailed plans for expanding the plantation's experimental programs to other locations throughout Louisiana. Whitmore had been corresponding with like-minded plantation owners, sharing his torture techniques and proposing the establishment of what he called correction facilities, where problematic slaves could be sent for rehabilitation. The papers revealed a network of sadists who were planning to systematize and commercialize torture, creating a business model built on human suffering. Most horrifying of all, Benjamin found a list of names, enslaved people from Whitmore Plantation who had been selected for the next phase of experiments, procedures so extreme that they were designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance. His own name was on the list, scheduled for sessions that previous subjects had not survived. But it was the discovery of children's names on these lists that finally pushed Benjamin past the point of no return. Whitmore was planning to expand his research to include juvenile subjects, believing that younger minds might respond differently to trauma and provide new insights into psychological manipulation techniques. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and so disturbing that Benjamin knew no external authority would ever be willing to believe it. In that moment, crouched in the darkness of Cornelius Whitmore's study with the monster's own words as proof of his evil, Benjamin Carter stopped being a victim and became an instrument of divine retribution. The night of August 15, 1847, began like any other nightmare at Whitmore Plantation, but it would end with screams that echoed across the bayou for entirely different reasons. Benjamin had spent weeks carefully coordinating with his 7 chosen allies. Men who had all survived Whitmore's torture, all lost family members to his sadism, and all reached the same conclusion that death was preferable to allowing this evil to continue. They had waited for the perfect opportunity, a night when Beauregard was away on business, when most of the household staff were attending a religious revival in town, and when Whitmore would be alone with his newest victim in the wash basin courtyard. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its justice. They would give Cornelius Whitmore exactly what he had given to so many others. As moonlight filtered through the Spanish moss, the 8 men moved like shadows through the plantation grounds, their bare feet making no sound on the familiar pathways they had walked in chains for so many years. They found Whitmore exactly where they expected, standing over the wash basin, preparing to begin another night of systematic torture on a young woman who was already barely conscious from previous abuse. What happened next was swift, coordinated, and utterly without mercy. They overpowered Whitmore and Beauregard simultaneously, using ropes and restraints that the 2 monsters had used on countless victims. The screams that followed weren't cries for help. They were the sounds of pure terror from men who suddenly understood what it felt like to be completely powerless in the hands of people who had every reason to hate them. The 8 men had become judge, jury, and executioner, carrying out a sentence that no court would ever have imposed, but that cosmic justice demanded. When the 8 survivors reached the town of Baton Rouge 3 days later, exhausted, traumatized, but carrying undeniable evidence of the horrors they had escaped, they expected to find salvation. Instead, they found a legal system that was more interested in protecting property rights than acknowledging their humanity. Benjamin Carter presented the torture journals, the correspondence about expanding the experimental programs, and detailed testimony about the crimes they had witnessed. But the authorities' response revealed the depth of institutional corruption that had allowed Whitmore's atrocities to continue unchecked. Rather than being hailed as heroes who had stopped a monster, the 8 men were immediately arrested and charged with the murder of 2 white men, regardless of the evidence they presented about their victims' crimes. The prosecutor argued that slaves had no legal right to take justice into their own hands, regardless of the provocation, and that allowing such actions would encourage dangerous precedents that could undermine the entire economic system of the South. The defense attorney assigned to represent them was an alcoholic lawyer with political debts who had no intention of mounting a serious defense that might anger influential plantation owners. Local newspapers portrayed the case not as a story about stopping torture and murder, but as an example of dangerous slave rebellion that threatened the safety of all white families. The same community that had turned a blind eye to Cornelius Whitmore's crimes now rallied to condemn the men who had ended them, revealing the ugly truth that preserving the existing order was more important than acknowledging even the most obvious injustice. Benjamin Carter realized that they had exchanged one form of death sentence for another, but at least they had died as free men who had chosen their own fate. The raid on Whitmore Plantation came too late to save the 8 condemned men, but it provided undeniable proof that their actions had been not only justified, but necessary. When federal authorities finally arrived at the plantation, prompted by pressure from Northern abolitionists who had learned of the case, they discovered a scene that defied human imagination and challenged the sanitized version of slavery that Southern society had worked so hard to maintain. The Wash Basin area had been transformed into a systematic torture facility with multiple stations for different types of abuse, complete with drainage systems for disposing of bodies and specialized restraining devices that showed clear evidence of long-term use. The authorities found rooms filled with instruments specifically designed for inflicting pain, medical equipment for keeping victims alive during extended torture sessions, and detailed records documenting hundreds of individual cases of abuse, torture, and murder. Hidden chambers beneath the plantation house revealed the remains of dozens of victims, their bones showing evidence of systematic trauma that correlated perfectly with the descriptions in Whitmore's journals. The investigators, many of whom had initially dismissed the 8 men's testimonies as exaggerated, found themselves confronting evidence so overwhelming and disturbing that several became physically ill during the examination process. Beauregard's quarters yielded additional documentation, including correspondence with other plantation owners who were interested in implementing similar programs, revealing a network of sanctioned torture that extended far beyond Whitmore Plantation. The official report, when it was finally published, described conditions that were so horrific that many newspapers refused to print the full details, claiming they were too disturbing for public consumption. Let's be real. The men who died in that wash basin weren't the refined gentlemen that Louisiana society had celebrated, but monsters whose carefully crafted public personas had hidden depths of evil that shocked even hardened investigators. The raid revealed Cornelius Whitmore's true history. A man who had been expelled from medical school in Philadelphia for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers, who had fled Virginia after being accused of torturing animals, and who had arrived in Louisiana with forged credentials and fabricated references. His family background, which he had claimed included generations of respected plantation owners, was entirely fictional. He was actually the son of a failed shopkeeper who had developed his sadistic tendencies early in life and had been systematically working to perfect them throughout his adult years. The medical examinations of his body revealed evidence of advanced syphilis, which may have contributed to his psychological deterioration and increasing willingness to engage in extreme violence. Marcus Beauregard's past was equally disturbing. He had been dismissed from previous overseer positions for excessive brutality, had been suspected but never charged in the disappearances of several enslaved people at other plantations, and had been actively seeking opportunities to participate in what he considered advanced slave management techniques. The correspondence found in their quarters revealed that both men had been in contact with similar individuals throughout the South, sharing techniques and discussing plans for establishing what they called correction academies, where problematic slaves could be sent for intensive rehabilitation programs. These weren't isolated monsters, but part of a broader network of individuals who had found ways to commercialize and systematize human torture while maintaining respectable facades in their local communities. The investigation into Whitmore Plantation uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that extended far beyond Louisiana's borders, revealing connections to similar operations throughout the American South and even internationally. Federal investigators discovered correspondence with plantation owners in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, all interested in implementing Whitmore's innovative discipline techniques and sharing information about subjects who had been subjected to various experimental procedures. Most disturbing were letters from individuals in Brazil and Cuba, where slavery was still legal and where even fewer legal protections existed for enslaved people, discussing the possibility of establishing offshore facilities where the most extreme experiments could be conducted without any risk of legal interference. The network included not just plantation owners, but also physicians, government officials, and business leaders who provided financial support, legal protection, and scientific justification for what was essentially a systematic program of torture and murder. Bank records showed that Whitmore had received significant investments from wealthy individuals throughout the region who expected returns based on the commercial applications of his research into psychological manipulation and behavioral control. The scope of the conspiracy suggested that hundreds, possibly thousands of enslaved people had been subjected to similar treatment at facilities throughout the slave-owning regions, with Whitmore's plantation serving as a central hub for developing and refining torture techniques that were then exported to other locations. International shipping records revealed that some of the specialized torture equipment found at Whitmore Plantation had been manufactured in Europe and shipped through intermediaries who claimed they were agricultural implements, suggesting that even foreign manufacturers were aware of and profiting from these activities. Now, you have to understand, the most disturbing aspect of this entire story isn't the individual evil of men like Cornelius Whitmore, but the systematic way that an entire society conspired to enable, protect, and profit from their crimes. The silence wasn't accidental. It was carefully orchestrated by powerful interests who understood that acknowledging the truth would threaten the economic and social foundations of their world. Local newspapers that received detailed reports about the raid on Whitmore Plantation chose to publish only brief, sanitized accounts that focused on property damage rather than human suffering. Religious leaders who had previously praised Whitmore's Christian stewardship suddenly developed selective memory about their previous endorsements, with some going so far as to suggest that the evidence had been planted by Northern agitators seeking to discredit Southern institutions. Government officials at every level, from parish sheriffs to state legislators, worked to minimize the significance of the discoveries and to prevent federal authorities from conducting similar investigations at other plantations. The medical establishment dismissed the evidence of systematic torture as exaggerated claims by unreliable witnesses, maintaining their theories about racial inferiority even when confronted with clear proof of white brutality. Most shamefully, many of the wealthy families who had socialized with Whitmore and benefited from his advice about slave management quietly destroyed evidence of their own associations with him, while publicly expressing shock at revelations that they had privately known about for years. The conspiracy of silence was so thorough and systematic that within a decade, most traces of the story had been erased from public memory, surviving only in whispered conversations among enslaved communities and buried government documents that wouldn't see daylight for generations. The 8 men who chose damnation over submission met their fate on a cold November morning in 1847, but their deaths became something their executioners never intended, a catalyst for change that would echo through history. Benjamin Carter and his 7 companions were hanged in the public square of Baton Rouge, but unlike typical executions that served as warnings to other enslaved people, their deaths sparked something entirely different. Word of their courage spread through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across the South, transforming them from criminals into martyrs and heroes whose names would be whispered in slave quarters for generations. The federal investigators who had uncovered the truth at Whitmore Plantation found themselves facing a campaign of systematic intimidation designed to silence their findings. Several received death threats. Others were reassigned to distant territories, and one simply disappeared without explanation after refusing to alter his official report. Thomas Caldwell, The Methodist preacher, whose initial testimony had been dismissed, experienced a strange vindication when the raid confirmed every detail of his horrific account. But the validation came at a cost that nearly destroyed him. He spent his remaining years traveling throughout the North, speaking at abolitionist meetings and bearing witness to what he had seen, but the trauma never left him. He died in 1852, still plagued by nightmares about the sounds of drowning and the sight of Whitmore's clinical cruelty. The plantation itself was seized by federal authorities, but the legal challenges lasted for years as Whitmore's family and creditors fought over the property, while the enslaved people who had survived his torture found themselves caught in legal limbo, neither free nor clearly owned by anyone else. Let's be real. The story of Whitmore Plantation forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, resistance, and the price of maintaining civilization in the face of absolute evil. Those 8 men who dragged Cornelius Whitmore to his wash basin weren't criminals in any moral sense. They were human beings who had been pushed beyond the limits of endurance and chose to act when every legal and social institution had failed them. Their story reveals the fundamental hypocrisy of a society that demanded enslaved people remain passive in the face of torture and murder, while simultaneously condemning them for taking the only action that could stop their tormentors. The legacy of Whitmore Plantation extends far beyond the specific crimes committed there. It represents the countless other locations where similar atrocities occurred in darkness and silence, protected by a conspiracy of willful ignorance that extended from local sheriffs to federal politicians. The documentation found at the plantation became crucial evidence in the abolitionist movement, providing undeniable proof of the systematic nature of slavery's brutality and helping to galvanize Northern opposition to the institution. But perhaps the most important legacy is the example set by Benjamin Carter and his companions, who demonstrated that there are circumstances where moral law supersedes human law, where resistance becomes not just justified, but necessary for the preservation of human dignity. Their story challenges us to examine our own willingness to confront evil when it hides behind respectability and legal protection, and to consider whether we would have the courage to act when all other options have been exhausted. The wash basin at Whitmore Plantation became a symbol of both ultimate evil and ultimate justice, a reminder that sometimes the only way to stop monsters is for good people to be willing to become something they never wanted to be. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? As you sit there processing this story, I want you to consider how many modern institutions claim respectability while hiding systematic abuse behind carefully crafted public images. Think about how often we dismiss victims' testimonies because their accusations seem too extreme to be believable, or how quickly we accept official explanations that protect powerful interests while silencing inconvenient truths. The tools of oppression may have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Predators still seek positions of authority, enablers still provide protection and cover, and society still finds ways to ignore evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions about the world we live in. Benjamin Carter's courage reminds us that sometimes ordinary people must make extraordinary choices to stop extraordinary evil, even when those choices come at the ultimate cost. If this story has shaken you, if it's made you question how well you really know the institutions and authorities you trust, then subscribe to Echoes of Truth and join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept comfortable lies over disturbing realities. Comment below with your thoughts about justice, resistance, and whether you believe you would have the courage to act like Benjamin Carter if you found yourself in similar circumstances. Share this story with others who need to understand that evil often wears respectable faces and that the price of stopping it is sometimes higher than we want to imagine. Next week, I'll be taking you inside the walls of a modern institution where authority figures have been systematically abusing their power for decades, protected by the same conspiracy of silence that shielded Cornelius Whitmore. Because some patterns never change, they just find new places to hide.